It's the year 2000, and dawn is breaking over the dense, sweltering jungles of Sierra Leone. Thick mist clings to the treetops, and a suffocating humidity hangs heavy in the air. Suddenly, the morning silence ruptures as the deep, throbbing hum of helicopter blades slices through the mist, building into a deafening roar. On the ground, a ragtag militia of heavily armed, drug-fueled fighters, the West Side Boys, spring into action. These men, some barely older than children, scramble for cover amid the confusion, clutching AK-47s and rocket-propelled grenades. At that moment, British Special Forces, the famed SAS and SBS, begin their descent. Operation Barras had begun, a mission as dangerous as it was audacious. But how did we get here? What drove Britain's most elite troops to risk everything in this lawless jungle, and who exactly were they fighting? To answer that, we must rewind and dig deep into Sierra Leone's troubled history. A country blessed with diamond-rich soil, but cursed by the bloodshed it funded. The 1990s had transformed this land of beauty into a war-torn nightmare, with conflict diamonds fueling a merciless civil war. The violence was relentless, tearing communities apart and plunging the nation into chaos. Warlords ruled with brutal authority, and a generation of children was forced into a life of horror as child soldiers. And then there were the West Side Boys. Born from the chaos, this militia was unlike any other. They were a wild and erratic gang, notorious for blending violence with absurd rituals and an obsession with American gangster culture. Heavily armed and constantly under the influence of drugs and alcohol, they terrorized the countryside. With their eccentric behavior, they seemed almost comical at times, but any humor ended there. These were ruthless killers who recruited child soldiers, held hostages, and carried out heinous acts with impunity. They were a product of a country where law and order had disintegrated and violence was the language of survival. It was in this nightmare landscape that a group of British soldiers found themselves ensnared. Ambushed and taken hostage, these men were thrust into the grip of the West Side Boys militia, their fate dangling by a thread. As news of the capture reached the British government, the stakes became unthinkably high. Diplomats would try their hand at negotiating, but each attempt seemed to worsen the tension further, endangering the hostages. The West Side Boys made erratic demands, taunting their captives and parading them as trophies. With no room for error, the decision was made: launch a full-scale military rescue operation. What followed was a mission that would test the mettle of even the most elite soldiers the Commonwealth had at their disposal: Operation Barras. But to truly grasp the magnitude of this operation, we need to delve deeper into the chaos of Sierra Leone's civil war. How did the country spiral so far out of control? What made the West Side Boys such a fearsome and unpredictable enemy? And why did this particular mission become one of the most perilous in British military history? Here at the front, we love making, researching, and sharing history content, but it isn't always easy with YouTube's super strict policies. That's where Armchair History TV comes in. Armchair History and the team have created a website that not only supports us as creators, but promotes freedom of speech and expression in content. We've had a long-term partnership with them, and it's been an absolute pleasure producing videos like the Bloody Battle of Iwo Jima, how American grit won the day, and the SS officer who tried to expose the true horrors of the Holocaust without having to stress about whether YouTube will demonetize or take the content down because unfiltered history doesn't suit their policies. To help fight back against this, we'd love you to join us using the link below and with the code THEFRONT on sign up to get 50% off a monthly or annual subscription. You'll get access to an exclusive library of over 250 videos, along with consistent exclusive production from myself, Armchair History TV, and Knowledgia, to name just a few. Hope to see you guys there. Sierra Leone's civil war was a tragedy that unfolded over the span of years, driven not only by internal corruption, but by a vicious struggle for its most valuable resource: diamonds. These blood diamonds, as they were called, were both a blessing and a curse, sparking greed, violence, and an international black market that thrived on human suffering. The Revolutionary United Front, or the RUF, the principal rebel group, emerged as a brutal force, tearing through the countryside with one objective: seizing control of the diamond mines. Their rule was painted in blood, leaving horror in their wake. Villages were razed, families destroyed, and mutilation became a signature terror tactic. They would hack off the limbs of men, women, and even children to spread fear. The RUF claimed to be liberators, but their actions made clear that no ideology justified such barbarism. The government, meanwhile, had crumbled into a shell of its former self. Sierra Leone, once a beacon of promise in West Africa, blessed with diamond-rich lands and a vibrant economy, had been gutted by corruption and neglect. The National Army had become a force of chaos. Unpaid and left to fend for themselves, soldiers were pushed to desperate acts, raiding villages, looting whatever they could, and using their weapons to survive. Many had given up on any sense of duty and instead defected or made deals with the rebels. They became known as Sobels, soldiers by day, rebels by night. Caught in this maelstrom of violence and corruption were the civilians, the ordinary people who bore the brunt of it all. They weren't just living in fear, they were trying to exist in a nightmare. Imagine waking up each day not knowing if a soldier in uniform was there to save you or destroy everything you hold dear. Families barricaded themselves indoors, their lives shrinking to the walls of their homes, praying that the next knock at the door wouldn't shatter what little they had left. In this power vacuum, self-defense groups like the Kamajors emerged. These militias, named after traditional hunters, initially served as community protectors. They were skilled in tracking and ambushing their enemies, using their knowledge of the forests. But even they couldn't escape the moral decay that pervaded the country. As the conflict dragged on, the Kamajors found themselves entangled in the same cycle of violence that had poisoned Sierra Leone. At times, they were saviors. At other times, they committed crimes that made them indistinguishable from the warlords they were supposed to fight. The societal breakdown laid the groundwork for the emergence of groups like the West Side Boys. Unlike the RUF or the Kamajors, they weren't seen as a militia driven by ideology or tradition. Instead, they embodied the raw chaos of a disintegrated nation. With no grand mission or political philosophy, they thrived on unpredictability and sheer brutality. What made them even more frightening was their embrace of drugs and alcohol. This only fueled their violent, erratic behavior, turning them into warriors who felt invincible. Their camps were surreal nightmares, festive chaos where rap music blared, drug-induced euphoria reigned, and violence simmered beneath the surface. Amid this chaos, international attention slowly turned towards Sierra Leone. Shocking reports of mass mutilations, child soldiers, and a society crumbling under relentless violence forced the world to acknowledge the humanitarian catastrophe. Yet, interventions were piecemeal and hesitant, plagued by bureaucratic red tape and geopolitical complexity. This hesitance only emboldened groups like the West Side Boys, who saw no credible threat to their power. The social fabric was so frayed that even the concept of stability seemed like an unattainable dream. This was the Sierra Leone that British forces would later enter, driven not by conquest or colonial ambition, but by desperate hope to restore some semblance of order to a nation teetering on the edge of total collapse. But who were the West Side Boys? These men, more often mere boys, were birthed from a society crumbling under the weight of corruption, greed, and unending violence. When law and order evaporated, the West Side Boys filled that void, fueled by a volatile cocktail of opportunism, brutality, and nihilistic self-indulgence. Their ranks were a melting pot of Sierra Leone's lost and angry. Ex-soldiers whose loyalty had evaporated when their paychecks stopped coming, child soldiers abducted from the forests and countryside, street kids who had grown up in the shadow of war, and disillusioned youth who saw violence as their only path to power. Survival was their only creed, and anarchy became their playground. Leading this gang was Brigadier Fode Calais, a man whose ambitions had nothing to do with ideology. Calais and his fellow commanders weren't revolutionaries. They were warlords in the purest sense, driven by the desire for power, wealth, and the immediate thrill of control. The allure of diamonds, the very lifeblood of Sierra Leone's conflict, was ever present, Yet the West Side Boys operated with a primal focus on territory and dominance rather than strategic control of resources. For them, violence wasn't just a tool, but a spectacle, a show of strength in a world where might truly made right. The West Side Boys wrapped themselves in a bizarre and terrifying image inspired by the global gang culture they saw in rap videos. They dressed in garish outfits, strutting through the jungle in stolen military fatigues, accessorized with flashy jewelry and absurd wigs, all while blaring Tupac from crackling speakers. But don't let the absurdity fool you. This wasn't theater for the sake of performance. It was a psychological tactic. The surreal mix of gangster swagger and jungle warfare made them seem untouchable, injecting fear and confusion into anyone who faced them. Drugs, of course, were a constant presence. And they weren't just vices, they were weapons that shattered inhibition and magnified chaos. The West Side Boys weren't content with simple raids or ambushes. They wanted to break people, to dominate them utterly. One of their most horrifying tactics was the conscription of child soldiers. These weren't mere recruits, they were children transformed into instruments of terror. Boys as young as 8 were kidnapped, forced to undergo brutal initiation rituals, and then drugged until reality itself seemed to bend. They were coerced into committing atrocities, sometimes against their own families, severing any possibility of returning to a normal life. The psychological trauma was profound, and that's exactly how the West Side Boys liked it, creating a generation too broken to resist and too dangerous to control. Villagers dreaded the sight of a West Side Boys column on the horizon, knowing that whatever came next would be dictated by the whims of fighters in a narcotic frenzy. Sometimes, the assault would end in looting and forced labor, other times it would be a massacre carried out with horrifying glee. Civilians were playthings in their war games, and survival often hinged on sheer luck. The group's commanders enforced a brutal hierarchy, demanding loyalty and rewarding cruelty. Moments of gunfire and carnage were interspersed with surreal, drug-fueled parties where laughter, gunshots, and screams mingled under the jungle canopy. It was a place where celebration and horror became indistinguishable. The West Side Boys were not fighting for any greater purpose. They were a symptom of Sierra Leone's deepest wounds, a violent embodiment of what happens when a society collapses and its moral compass shatters. And then came August 25th, 2000, a day that would sear itself into the memories of all who witnessed the West Side Boys' ruthlessness. On that day, deep in the sweltering jungles of Sierra Leone, the world would be given a brutal reminder of the gang's unpredictable and violent nature. British soldiers found themselves in the crosshairs of the West Side Boys on that fateful day. They were members of the 1st Battalion, Royal Irish Regiment. This unit was part of a wider, United Nations-backed peacekeeping mission in Sierra Leone. The oppressive jungle heat sapped strength and focus, while the dense, almost impenetrable vegetation limited visibility and created an ideal environment for ambushes. It was a place where the very terrain seemed to conspire against the peacekeepers. The mission of the RIR in Sierra Leone was multifaceted. On a typical day, the soldiers performed crucial tasks to support the fragile peace. Their duties included patrolling key regions to deter rebel incursions, securing vital humanitarian aid routes to prevent attacks, and engaging with local communities to foster trust and cooperation. On the day of the ambush, the 12-man patrol from the 1st Battalion went on to what they believed to be a straightforward mission: a security visit to the Jordanian UN peacekeeping base at Masiyaka. Driving cautiously in a convoy of 3 Land Rovers, one modified to carry a 50 cal machine gun, another full of radio equipment, and a third standard variant, the soldiers navigated through a labyrinth of narrow, overgrown paths. As the patrol ventured further into unfamiliar territory, the jungle seemed to close in around them, an oppressive, living wall that concealed danger. Then, without warning, the West Side Boys materialized from the underbrush. Dozens of heavily armed rebels, many just teenagers, brandished AK-47s and rocket-propelled grenades. Vehicles blocked the patrol's path, including a Sierra Leone army truck now in rebel hands, its dual-mounted Russian 14.5mm machine guns aimed ominously at the trapped convoy. Commanders of the West Side Boys, dressed in a nightmarish blend of stolen military fatigues and outlandish accessories, approached with a menacing swagger. Colonel Savage, one of the rebel leaders, accused the British soldiers of violating his territory, his voice laced with both arrogance and the erratic energy of someone teetering on the edge. The tension was suffocating. The British troops knew they had no escape, no cover to make a stand. Resistance was not an option. Powerless and surrounded, the soldiers were forced to surrender. The West Side Boys moved in, stripping them of their weapons and binding their hands, turning them from well-trained peacekeepers into prisoners of a savage conflict. The captors, eyes wild and movements erratic, paraded their new trophies deeper into the jungle, their laughter and taunts echoing through the oppressive greenery. Captain Dennis Flaherty described the surreal and terrifying atmosphere. The noise, the chaos, the wild look in their eyes. It was like being surrounded by demons in a place where reason didn't exist. We had to keep our composure, no matter how much we wanted to fight or run. The arrival at the West Side Boys' camp at Gaberi Bana was a descent into a waking nightmare. The camp sprawled like a chaotic fever dream, a tangle of ramshackle huts and makeshift shelters thrown together from mud, corrugated metal, and rotting wood. It was a realm where law had disintegrated and raw brutality reigned supreme. The settlement pulsed with menace, a grotesque hybrid of a rebel fortress and a gangster's den. Weapons lay strewn everywhere, from rusted rocket-propelled grenades to anti-aircraft guns ominously pointed skyward, as if even the heavens weren't safe from the madness below. After a tour of the village given by Colonel Cambodia, the reality of the situation sank in. Any escape would be a near impossibility. The air inside was thick and stifling, heavy with the stench of unwashed bodies, gunpowder, and the sickly sweet reek of narcotics. The walls, plastered with sun-bleached posters of rap stars and scenes from gangster films, bore silent witness to the camp's deranged culture. Shattered moments of quiet were replaced without warning by bursts of gunfire, raucous shouting, or the disturbed thump of rap music echoing through the jungle. Mock executions became a sinister ritual used by the West Side Boys to keep the captives in a perpetual state of dread. The prisoners would be yanked down from whatever meager rest they managed to snatch and marched to a clearing. There, with their guns pressed to their temples or aimed at their backs, they would be forced to kneel in the mud. The rebels would toy with them, taunting and jeering, before counting down from 10, making the prisoners believe that each sinister performance might be their last experience on Earth. At the final count, the West Side Boys would either pull the trigger on empty chambers or dissolve into fits of hysterical laughter, treating the trauma they inflicted as twisted entertainment. Every time they lined us up, Corporal Peter Nelson of the Royal Irish Regiment remembered, we didn't know if it was just another scare or if that was it. You'd hear the click of the guns, and in that moment, everything seemed to stop. The grim anticipation of imminent death hung heavy over the hostages, seeping into every interaction and every heartbeat. The psychological toll was relentless, a constant test of nerve and discipline as the soldiers were forced to mask their terror, knowing that any show of vulnerability could incite even more cruelty from their captors. The British captives were under relentless watch, their every move monitored by guards, high on a cocktail of drugs, their fingers twitching on the triggers of their guns. Some of the prisoners endured the sweltering heat in an open holding area where biting insects swarmed like a living shroud, drawing blood with every sting. Others were hauled to a place far more insidious, the infamous dungeon, a pit that seemed to have been conjured straight from hell. This hole was a festering swamp of filth where prisoners could neither stand nor lay down, all the while in putrid water, the mud sucking at their feet, making every shift a struggle against the mire. Major Alan Marshall later recounted, every second in that camp was a game of survival. You couldn't show weakness, but you couldn't show defiance either. It was a balancing act that could mean life or death. Corporal Musa Bangura, a Sierra Leonean liaison officer who had also been captured with the convoy, bore the brunt of the camp's cruelty. The West Side Boys felt he was a traitor working with the Brits. They beat me because they saw me as a traitor to my own people, he recalled. But I knew I couldn't give in. I had to keep my strength, even if it meant enduring more. He painted a picture of madness. I'd seen violence before, but this was madness, mixed with something almost theatrical. The wigs, the music, the drugs, it was as if they were trying to become gods of chaos. For the captured soldiers, hope flickered only faintly, kept alive by sheer discipline and the refusal to let fear take hold. In this realm of darkness and chaos, survival was an unending battle, not just against the camp's inhuman conditions, but against the pervasive, mind-breaking sense of dread that settled like a shadow over every soul. Sergeant Major Bill Wilson, reflecting on his own role, said, "I had to keep the men together. Desperation is contagious, and if one of us gave into it, the whole group could unravel. We had to hold the line, even if it was just in our minds." News of the capture travelled swiftly, setting off alarms in the highest echelons of British government. Prime Minister Tony Blair was immediately briefed, and the gravity of the situation became evident. This was more than a hostage crisis. It was a test of Britain's resolve and a potential flashpoint that could destabilise ongoing peace efforts in Sierra Leone. Failure to act decisively could embolden other armed groups and threaten the fragile stability that Britain had been hoping to restore. The lives of the British soldiers were at stake, and so was the nation's credibility. In London, an emergency crisis team assembled, bringing together top officials from the Ministry of Defence, the Foreign Office, and intelligence services. High-stakes discussions unfolded, with advisors weighing the pros and cons of possible responses. On the one hand, negotiation was less risky but fraught with complications. The West Side Boys' unpredictability made them an untrustworthy adversary. There was no way to guarantee that negotiation would succeed, and every hour raised the possibility of the hostages being executed or moved deeper into the jungle, making rescue impossible. As the debates raged, military planners leaned toward a more aggressive solution: a full-scale rescue mission. Intelligence painted a grim but clear picture of the risks. The hostages faced brutal treatment, and any delay could be catastrophic. A consensus began to emerge. Only a carefully coordinated military strike could ensure the safety of the captives. But such an operation would have to be executed with surgical precision. The responsibility for this daring mission fell to Britain's elite special forces, the Special Air Service, Special Boat Service, and the 1st Battalion Parachute Regiment known as 1st Para. Given the complexity of the situation, these units began planning Operation Barras, a dual assault strategy designed to overwhelm the enemy and extract the hostages. Yet, to pull off such a feat, they needed detailed and actionable intelligence. In the lead-up to a potential assault, the SAS, brought upriver by the SBS teams, laid motionless for hours on end and used advanced listening equipment as well as direct observation to track the militants' movements and map out the camps. The jungle environment was as formidable as the enemy, thick, humid, and teeming with dangers both natural and human. Camouflaged in the undergrowth and moving with absolute silence, the operatives endured the sweltering heat and relentless insect attacks as they watched the West Side Boys' camp for days, relaying what intelligence they could. One advantage they had was the relative lack of technology used by the West Side Boys meant communication via radio from the SAS to their base of operations was immune from being overheard by the rebels. The West Side Boys' camps at Giberi Bana and Magbeni were sprawling labyrinths of huts and makeshift fortifications, forming a chaotic maze. Magbeni was the larger and more established of the two, and it sat along the Rokel Creek, a strategic location that gave the West Side Boys control over river access and the surrounding terrain. It was a stronghold they had fortified to withstand assaults, with sandbag defensive positions and heavy weapons mounted in key locations. The two villages, separated by the Rokel Creek, were formidable and would require a coordinated assault on both locations to succeed. Soon, the plan would be finalized. At dawn, Chinook and Lynx helicopters would insert troops into the jungle, using the cover of the morning mist to achieve maximum surprise. One assault team would storm Giberi Bana to rescue the hostages, while another would secure Magbeni, neutralizing any attempts by the West Side Boys to reinforce their comrades. The task force assembled for Operation Barras represented the pinnacle of Britain's military prowess. The Special Air Service and Special Boat Service were veterans of countless covert missions. Their reputation for precision and lethality preceded them, but even they knew that the West Side Boys were a dangerous adversary and more firepower would be needed. The 1st Battalion Parachute Regiment brought raw firepower to the operation, ready to act as a hammer should any part of the plan go awry. Major Alan Marshall and Captain Dennis Flaherty, who led the group of captured British soldiers, struggled to keep morale from collapsing. They used every ounce of their training to maintain some semblance of order and discipline among the hostages. Marshall, in particular, had to carefully balance showing defiance without provoking their captors into further violence. Yet, despite the dire situation, the two officers managed to seize an opportunity that would later become crucial to the rescue. This opportunity arose during a high-stakes meeting between Lieutenant Colonel Simon Fordham, the commanding officer of the Royal Irish Regiment, and Fode Calais. The meeting was arranged in an attempt to negotiate the release of the hostages and took place under extreme tension. Calais and his entourage, heavily armed and visibly intoxicated, surrounded Fordham. Calais' demands were outlandish and inconsistent, including a request for safe passage to the UK to study at university and a promise of amnesty from prosecution. His demeanor swung wildly from menacing threats to inappropriate laughter, making constructive dialogue nearly impossible. During this tense negotiation, Calais brought forward Major Marshall and Captain Flaherty to confirm that the hostages were still alive. It was then that Major Marshall executed a daring act of ingenuity. As he reached to shake hands with Colonel Fordham, he managed to secretly slip a hand-drawn map into his palm. This piece of paper sketched out the camp's layout, highlighting the locations of key structures, heavy weapons, and the building where hostages were confined. Even with the hope that came from successfully passing along the map, the hostages' ordeal did not let up. The West Side Boys' camp remained a place filled with tension and hardship. The prisoners were constantly on edge, never certain what might come next, as their captors' unpredictable behavior kept them in a state of anxiety. Musa Bangura, the Sierra Leonean liaison officer, suffered increasingly harsh treatment, facing repeated beatings and cruelty that underscored the captors' sheer brutality. As international scrutiny grew and the pressure mounted, Calais and his commanders made a calculated gamble: a selective release of prisoners. This was no act of mercy, but a move designed to manipulate perceptions and strengthen their own hand. What they craved were radios and satellite phones, devices that could amplify their demands to the world. By seizing control of the airwaves, they aimed to broadcast their grievances and threats, dangling the fate of the captives over the heads of the British government and international community. The West Side Boys made a spectacle of freeing married soldiers, an attempt to appear compassionate or reasonable. It was a performance meant to curry public sympathy, a cynical ploy to paint themselves as more than mere butchers. However, in the end, they did keep behind several married signals officers as hostages, including Captain Flaherty, individuals whose expertise in communication technology made them too valuable to release. Once the West Side Boys acquired the satellite phones and radios, they moved swiftly to leverage these tools to their advantage. Almost immediately, their camp was abuzz with activity as their leaders made contact with the outside world. These devices were their new lifeline, granting them the ability to project their demands and grievances beyond the remote jungles of Sierra Leone and onto a global stage. Calais and his commanders used the satellite phones to reach out to foreign media outlets, including the BBC, humanitarian organizations, and even international diplomats. They crafted messages that painted themselves as more than just a ragtag band of drug-fueled militiamen. Instead, they attempted to portray themselves as political actors with grievances that deserved serious consideration. The decision to proceed with Operation Barras came after an alarming series of developments made it clear that a peaceful resolution was slipping out of reach. On September 9th, Colonel Cambodia, one of the West Side Boys' leaders, made a demand that alarmed negotiators. He claimed the remaining 6 Royal Irish Regiment soldiers would only be released once a new government was formed in Sierra Leone, the West Side Boys having felt left out of the earlier Lomé peace accords. This unrealistic demand convinced the British negotiators that the militia had no intention of seriously negotiating a resolution. Instead, the behavior seemed to be an attempt to stall and gain leverage. At the same time, SAS teams stationed near the West Side Boys' camp reported a troubling absence of any signs of the captives. For 4 days, they had observed the area without any visual confirmation of the hostages' whereabouts, increasing fears that the militia might either move the captives further into the jungle or even harm them. The threat of losing track of the hostages or seeing them move to a location that would make rescue far more difficult left British officials with little choice. Concluding that the risk to the hostages was escalating, Cobra decided it was time to act, giving the green light for the assault to begin. The men who would carry out the mission knew that failure was not an option. As dawn approached and final checks were made, Operation Barras stood ready to unfold, a calculated gamble where the line between success and disaster was razor thin. As dawn broke, the helicopters roared into action, cutting through the mist that blanketed the swampy jungle terrain. The sudden thunder of rotor blades shattered the morning quiet, plunging the West Side Boys into confusion. Paratroopers from 1 Para descended into the chaos, fast roping with precision into designated landing zones around Magbene, while the SAS and boat troop men descended on Geberibana. As they hit the ground, they immediately established a perimeter and opened fire on enemy positions, engaging in fierce firefights with the startled militia. The Lynx attack helicopters swooped in low, unleashing a torrent of suppressive fire on enemy fortifications. Their job was to keep the militia off balance, targeting machine gun nests and other strong points to prevent any organized resistance. The Sierra Leonean Mi-24 Hind gunship joined the fray, its heavy cannon and rockets tearing through enemy emplacements. The combined firepower of these aircraft turned the tide early, but the situation on the ground remained perilous. The SAS observation teams led the assault on Geberibana, finally allowed to open fire on the men who they saw torment their comrades for days. Their primary objective was clear: reach the hut where the hostages were held before the West Side Boys could react. However, the jungle proved a worthy adversary, and the SAS had to order the impending Chinooks to hold station until they could get into position. The guards were swiftly neutralized, and the hostages were secured. Inside, the hostages were found in a state of shock, weak from malnutrition and exhaustion, but alive. Musa Bangura and the British soldiers, who had endured weeks of psychological and physical torment, were quickly assessed by medics and prepared for extraction. The SAS and boat troop operatives formed a protective cordon around the hostages, ready to respond to any counterattack from the militia. Meanwhile, intense combat unfolded at Magbeni. The West Side Boys, though taken by surprise, mounted a fierce defense. Armed with AK-47s, RPGs, and anti-aircraft guns mounted on pickup trucks, they fired relentlessly at the advancing paratroopers. The British forces responded with well-coordinated firepower. The men of 1 Para took up strategic positions around Magbeni on the opposite shore from the ongoing rescue mission, picking off enemy fighters, while mortar teams lobbed high-explosive rounds into militia positions, sowing further chaos. Despite the overwhelming force arrayed against them, some of the West Side Boys launched desperate counterattacks, charging through the underbrush in wild, drug-fueled assaults. These attempts were quickly repelled by disciplined and well-armed British troops who held their ground with remarkable composure. Back at Geberibana, the rescue operation reached its climax. The hostages were hurried to the extraction zone, shielded by the SAS and watched over by helicopters as they moved swiftly through the jungle. The Chinook helicopters were poised and ready to lift the entire team to safety. As gunfire and explosions echoed through the trees, the hostages and assault teams scrambled aboard the waiting aircraft. The Chinooks ascended, heavy with the weight of men and equipment, as enemy reinforcements began to appear on the horizon. The extraction was a whirlwind of noise and adrenaline. The sound of rotor blades mixed with the crack of rifle fire, a cacophony that underscored just how narrow the margin for error had been. The helicopters lifted off just in time, leaving the West Side Boys stunned and in total disarray. The entire operation had unfolded in a matter of hours, but for those on the ground, it felt like a lifetime. Against incredible odds, Operation Barras had succeeded. All hostages were rescued, and the power of the West Side Boys was broken in one of the most daring rescue missions in modern British military history. As the Chinook helicopters lifted off from the chaos of the West Side Boys encampment, carrying the rescued hostages, prisoners, and British assault teams, a powerful sense of relief washed over everyone aboard. The soldiers remained on high alert, eyes trained on the dense, sprawling jungle below for any last-minute threats. The adrenaline still coursed through their veins, their senses heightened, their hands gripping their weapons, ready for anything. Yet, as the helicopters climbed higher, leaving behind the smoldering wreckage of the rebel camp, the realization began to sink in. They had pulled off one of the most daring and precise rescue missions in modern history. The ride back to base was filled with a mix of exhaustion and pride. The tension in the air was slowly replaced by the dawning awareness that everyone was alive, hostages and assault teams alike. When the Chinooks finally touched down at the secured base in Sierra Leone, the scene exploded into action. Medics rushed forward, prepared for the worst, as the hostages, visibly weakened and emotionally drained, were carefully escorted off the aircraft. Musa Bangura, the Sierra Leonean liaison officer, and the British soldiers who had endured weeks of psychological and physical torment were swiftly surrounded by a phalanx of medical support staff. The hostages had been battered, starved, and terrorized, and now they were receiving the life-saving care they so desperately needed. Emergency treatments began immediately, addressing dehydration, infections, and the bruises that mapped their bodies. The British soldiers who had conducted the assault were no less affected. Their faces were lined with exhaustion, and their uniforms were soaked through with sweat and grime. Some quietly embraced their comrades, while others sat in silence, staring into the distance as the adrenaline slowly ebbed away. There was immense pride in what they had accomplished, but it was tempered with a sobering awareness of just how close they had come to disaster. Every soldier knew that Operation Barras would go down as a case study in military precision, a testament to their training, discipline, and courage under fire. Yet they also knew that a single misstep could have ended in a catastrophe, an outcome none of them wanted to contemplate. Back in London, the successful execution of Operation Barras created ripples throughout the corridors of power. Prime Minister Tony Blair, who had been closely monitoring the situation in real time, did not waste a moment in commending the armed forces for their extraordinary bravery and flawless execution. The operation was not only a testament to military prowess, but also a powerful statement about the UK's commitment to global humanitarian intervention. Blair's government had staked a great deal on this mission, and its success provided a significant political boost, reinforcing the narrative that Britain was a force for stability in an increasingly volatile world. The operation also sent shockwaves beyond the UK, capturing the attention of international allies and adversaries alike. It drew global focus back to the ongoing crisis in Sierra Leone, a country ravaged by years of brutal civil war. The annihilation of the West Side Boys was seen as a turning point. Humanitarian organizations and world leaders renewed calls for action, motivated by the hope that peace could finally be within reach. The daring nature of the raid underscored the gravity of the situation in the country, making it harder for the international community to ignore the suffering that had gone on for far too long. On the ground in Sierra Leone, the impact of Operation Barras was seismic. The West Side Boys had been a symbol of the lawlessness and chaos that had gripped the nation, their acts of violence and terror spreading fear across the countryside. Their obliteration in such a high-profile fashion sent a clear and powerful message to other insurgent groups. The days of unchallenged brutality were over. The raid shattered the aura of invincibility that surrounded these militias and emboldened the government, as well as international peacekeeping forces, to press forward with renewed vigor. In the weeks and months that followed, British forces deepened their involvement in Sierra Leone. The UK committed resources and expertise to train and reform the Sierra Leonean military, transforming it from a demoralized and under-resourced force into a more capable and disciplined unit. British military advisors focused on strengthening local governance, supporting efforts to disarm and demobilize rebel groups, and helping build a foundation for lasting peace. The momentum created by Operation Barras played a crucial role in weakening the hold of other militias and brought new hope to a war-weary population. Operation Barras ultimately stood as a powerful symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, courage and unity could pave the way for a brighter future. It remains etched in the annals of military history, a testament to the heroism and precision of the soldiers who risked everything to bring about a moment of light in a land long shrouded in shadow. If you want to know more about the specifics of Operation Barras, I highly recommend you read Damian Lewis's Operation Certain Death, which talks about all the events and timeline I mentioned in this video with greater depth than we have time to go into today. So once again, I highly recommend the book as it's such an entertaining read. But anyways, what do you think about the entire operation and Sierra Leone? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new. Help us fight back against YouTube censorship and join us over at Armchair History TV, where we can make exclusive content without worrying about what the YouTube overlords deem as acceptable historical content. Use the link below and with the code THEFRONT on sign up to get 50% off a monthly or annual subscription.